I would like to pay elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. For over 60,000 years, First Nations people have been caring for country and protecting nature. I would like to extend that respect to all First Nations communities. And as we begin, I'd like you to everyone who's on the call today, pop in the country on which you're calling from. Thanks. You just got the notification, so we are recording today's webinar so that we can share this with you after the recording and also people who aren't able to make it today. So if you wouldn't like to be recorded, please keep your camera off and please ensure that your mic is unmuted throughout the session. Today we'll be hearing from 3 speakers that will explore and discuss the greater glider ecology and conservation efforts here in Queensland, major threats to the greater glider, and the role of protected areas in saving the greater glider going forward. Throughout the session, please feel free to pop any questions you may have for our speakers in the chat box, and we'll have about half an hour at the end to answer those and go through them. Following the presentation and Q&A, we'll share more about how we might take action towards saving the greater glider and its home range here in Queensland, and invite you to join our campaigns and allies in fighting for their protection. So first up, to begin, it's my pleasure to introduce ecologist Paul Reevey from Wildlife Queensland and Friends of Parks Queensland. Paul spends a lot of his time researching and documenting forest fauna throughout the state and has a special love of the greater glider. As an ecologist and zoologist, Paul is a passionate advocate for the conservation of Queensland's threatened mammal species with a focus on the glider species, brush-tailed rock wallabies and the spotted-tailed vole. So over to you, Paul. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I see some familiar names there, so it's nice to have you all online with us. So yeah, I'm just going to give a bit of a brief introduction into the greater glider and some of their threats and what we've been doing at Wildlife Queensland to both research and conserve the species. So yeah, as you probably all know, they're our largest gliding possum, so they're quite a sizable animal. They can be greater than 1 metre long from nose to the tip of their tail, though most of that is tail, and they can weigh up to almost 2 kilos. So that's a pretty hefty animal to be around in the trees. Just like koalas, they're folivores, so they rely purely on eucalyptus leaves, and they have a few different preferences depending on where you are throughout their range in eastern Australia. The biggest thing that's relevant for today is their high demand for hollows. So they probably have the highest demand for hollows of any of our arboreal species, many of which are hollow dependent, but greater gliders on average use anywhere between 3 and 8 hollows per individual within their home range, which is normally only a couple of hectares. You know, in good habitat, it can be 1 to 2 hectares. In poorer habitat, it can stretch to over 10 and even close to 20 at times out in Western areas. But yeah, massive amount of hollows and large hollows needed in those home ranges to support populations of greater gliders. So one individual has been recorded using up to 20 hollows. So that's a massive demand, and it means we need a lot of old trees in our forests. So we can flick to the next slide there, please. Fantastic. So yeah, as it says there, hollows equal homes. So gliders tend to den in the oldest and largest trees in the forest. So that's something we're losing through logging and through habitat destruction, and also through bushfires as well. Those are the 3 main threats to greater gliders, and it all comes down to that one fact of those different threatening processes reduce the number of hollow-bearing trees in the landscape and the number of hollows. And we're talking about a big animal, as I mentioned earlier, so they need a really big hollow to support them. So we're talking about minimum of 120, but probably 150 to 180 years for hollows to form in trees that will support greater gliders. So, you know, if we go out and plant trees today, that's fantastic. We're improving habitat, but we're looking at a couple of centuries before that habitat's going to be really useful and have good utility for greater gliders. So we're facing a really big bottleneck at the moment. We're losing hollows still at fairly significant and alarming rates, and we're just not being able to replace those hollow-bearing trees. So protecting every single tree that has a hollow is absolutely vital. And in places like our state forests and national parks, we really need to keep those big intact spaces. That's one thing you'll notice every time you read about greater glider habitat, is that they require those intact forest patches. And, you know, if we go into state forests where you've got logging going on and they're removing 50% of the biomass of large trees in any given hectare, afterwards, is that really something we're going to consider an intact forest? It's really alarming because those state forests really do play a vital role in supporting those large connected greater glider populations that remain in southern Queensland. So jump onto the next slide. So a lot of the work we've been doing is surveying for greater gliders, and we did some pretty broad scale surveys throughout southern Queensland in the wake of the 2019-20 bushfires. Greater gliders were already declining quite significantly before those fires, but then they came along and in the space of a handful of months wiped out about 30% of greater glider habitat throughout their range in Eastern Australia. And Queensland probably didn't get hit as badly as the southern states during those fires, but some of our really important stronghold greater glider populations were affected. Main Range, Mount Barney, up in the Sunshine Coast hinterland around Jimna, really good populations of greater gliders there previously. But after we did work post-fire, we found that there were still gliders in all those locations, which is promising, but not in anywhere near the numbers they were prior to the fires. So losing those hollows and the direct mortality, starvation and things in the wake of those fires has really knocked those populations around. The other important thing we found from that, because we looked at a lot of habitat, we did habitat assessments in all areas we found greater gliders and areas where we didn't find greater gliders. And though it's a fairly small data set, one thing came across pretty clearly, and that was the fact that you needed quite a few trees in each given transect, which was 100 by 100 metres, over 50 centimetres in DB8. So if we didn't have trees that size, and preferably a few over 80, if you didn't have trees that size, you wouldn't get gliders. And we found gliders were pretty much absent or very, very rare on private property, and then became more common in state forests and national parks. So really critical that we keep those large patches of habitat, because they have disappeared from areas that have been severely fragmented. And, we went into areas where there was clumps of large trees. You'd have a couple of hectares where you had old trees that had survived, rounds and rounds of logging sort of starting around 1900. But because they were isolated, they didn't have greater gliders, even though the habitat there over a small area was suitable. It really needed to be large connected patches of hundreds of hectares, containing, reasonable densities of large trees and hollows to support greater glider populations. So the key message from that is that we need to retain what we've got rather than replanting. Replanting, as I said earlier, is fantastic, but it's not going to solve the short-term problem. It's something for the future, and we really need to secure those populations of greater gliders now, or we are going to lose them from the landscape, and that would be absolutely tragic. They're incredibly beautiful species. Once you've seen one up close, you can't help but love them, with those big fluffy ears and that big long tail and those big bulgy eyes. They really are like little tree teddy bears, look a little bit like a gremlin. And the other thing there that I've got on that slide is that nest boxes, which are a bit of a stopgap solution, bit of a band-aid, haven't been overly successful in southern Queensland. We're not quite sure of the reason why. Some of the work we'll be doing at Wildlife Queensland over the next year or so will GPS collar greater gliders and look at their interactions around areas where we know we've got greater gliders. We've got decent numbers of artificial hollows, nest boxes in trees. So we'll be checking out exactly why they're not using those hollows, looking at temperature and humidity in the hollows, comparing that with the native tree cavities that the gliders are using. So should get some really decent information out of that, which will both inform our nest box design and help us to come up with more of those micro habitat variables, those smaller scale variables at a site scale that sort of dictate whether greater gliders will or will not be present. So I think that's just about me done, folks.
Thank you so much, Paul, for those insights and for all the work that you, Jess and Matt and the other team at Wildlife Queensland and Friends of Parks are doing to save this incredibly unique and gorgeous animal that you have quite clearly pointed out. Just a reminder to everybody that if you do have questions for Paul, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to them very shortly after the other presentations. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Martin Taylor, a conservation scientist at the University of Queensland, who will explain a little bit further in further detail how the southern and central greater glider came to be endangered and the major threats to their survival that continue today. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Natalie. You can quickly flick to the next slide. And then just the next slide, there's just some pictures of the different subspecies, now species. So back again, sorry. Yeah. I just wanted to acknowledge, no, keep going forward one. Okay, just want to acknowledge, no, back one. Just want to acknowledge Teresa Eyre. I see Teresa in the audience, and you know, the incredible work that Teresa has done putting together the guide to Glader habitat in Queensland, and which I've drawn upon, as well as all the other spatial layers. I'm not a field ecologist. I don't do any field work with gliders, but I do spatial analysis. It's my specialty, and also I analyse the effectiveness of environmental legislation. So moving to the next slide, we see these are Queensland Government models, habitat models for the broadly classified P volans. And what we see is that 44% of the model pre-clearing habitat has been cleared. So that's the pink in the image there. I've got the actual wild what is it called again? WildNet records there are the little dots on the map where gliders have been recorded in WildNet, which is the herbarium's wildlife sightings database. And it's no surprise that you see the real guts to the habitat here in southeast Queensland has just been decimated. And not only removed, but also highly fragmented, which is another very important thing for gliders, the fragmentation of the habitat, the inability to move between patches of habitat where the patch distances, separations become too wide. So the next slide, please. Yeah, so let's look at the current land use of the areas that have been cleared and lost. So in that pink area, what is the current land use? And we see that really, you know, livestock pastures dominate. It's 70% of the clearing that's happened is because of development. And I like to use the word development when I talk about livestock pastures. People think development is just houses, but development is raising a forest and turning it into a pasture. That's development too. And it's the dominant form of development. It's the major form of development in Queensland. And then the other point is that a lot of the areas that were, you know, that are currently under intensive uses or cropping and plantations, they were probably originally cleared for pastures before later more intensive development came along. So livestock pasture is the #1 driver of historical loss. What about, oh, sorry, I'm pressing down on my arrow. Could you move to the next slide? Thanks. So what is the more recent, so what habitat's remaining? So what land use is it in? And we see that only 19% is in conserved areas. And those are I think, I can't remember, I did this else. I think that's both nature refuges and state reserves, national parks and so forth. Sorry, no, it's only state national parks. And so the next big category we see is forestry. And so this cuts to one of the themes of this webinar, is that 23% of remaining habitat is in state forests, right? So hence, you know, if you want a recipe for how to prevent, as Paul says, to retain habitat, what's left, stop logging the state forests, transfer them to national parks, stop clearing of forests for livestock pasture, right? Because that's the other 56% of that remaining is under a grazing land use, either freehold or leasehold land use. So moving down again, sorry, next slide. So let's look at the more recent clearing of habitat in the 2019 to 2021 2-year period. Of that was mapped as remaining in 2019 by the herbarium. So how much remained? We saw over 20,000 hectares cleared in just those 2 years. So 10,000 hectares of glider habitat, remaining habitat, is being cleared every year. I mean, that figure just shocks me. Mind you, 15,000 of that is 74% of it is partial clearing. So that's either thinning of livestock pastures. They run through and take out half the vegetation and call it thinning. You have selective logging, of course, in the state forests and on private land. So it's not necessarily all just total wall-to-wall clearing, right? And you know, 27% of those is for forestry, right? So again, forestry is a really big component in recent clearing. It's not the biggest pasture, livestock pasture is still the biggest driver of clearing, 68%. Next slide, please. And it's still going on. I mean, this is February last year. This is just, so if you look at the top of the screen there, that's Esk State Forest. A lot of that's just plantation now. But south of Esk State Forest, this is greater glider and koala habitat, 46 hectares bulldozed for beef. It's a beef property near Esk in February last year. Next slide, please. And so my question is, why aren't the laws stopping this? Well, there's if we look at state law, you've got the Vegetation Management Act. And of course, the thing about this area is all of it's just mapped exempt on a property map. It's exempt from the Vegetation Management Act, right? The Nature Conservation Act has gaping loopholes I'll get to in the next slide. And then you have the national layer. So greater glider and koalas listed under the EPBC Act. Well, forestry is exempt in RFA areas. So, and regardless that Queensland doesn't have an RFA, it's still exempt because it's an RFA area. So if you read the Act, it's incredible. You don't have to have an actual regional forest agreement because it's in an RFA area under the language of the Act. And so it's still exempt. So it doesn't matter what's in the agreement, apparently. Forestry is still exempt in Southeast Queensland. And then the other huge problem is this mass non-compliance by graziers with the EPBC Act. There's virtually no compliance with the EPBC Act by graziers. And the worst thing is the regulator has been allowing them to get away with that for the last 20 years. It's a shocking scandal. The next slide, please. And so the Nature Conservation Act, why is it toothless? Well, look at section 88.3. It's a defence to a charge of taking a protected animal to prove that the taking happened in the course of a lawful activity that was not directed towards the taking, and the taking could not have been reasonably avoided. In other words, if you got out of your bulldozer and aimed a gun at a protected species, a koala or whatever, oh, naughty, you know, you're liable under the Nature Conservation Act. But if you drive a bulldozer through the habitat, and you can argue in court, oh, well, it wasn't directed at the wildlife itself. I wasn't trying to shoot it or kill it. And I couldn't reasonably avoid it because I had to clear this from my pasture. I mean, this is a absolute glaring loophole in the Nature Conservation Act that needs to be closed. It's shocking. It's scandalous. And the same, there's these loopholes go for protected plants. They go for tampering with an animal breeding place. The same loophole crops up. Next slide, please. Under the Vegetation Management Act, there's a complex slide. I won't go into all of it. As we know, most clearing is for pasture development. A lot of it is advanced regrowth. So when I'm saying advanced regrowth, 64% is either remnant or more than 15 years old. And so a more than 15 years old forest can be 10, 15 meters high. Yeah, this is a real forest. It's not a joke. And so, you know, a lot of that's exempt. So 82% of wooding clearing is exempt. And it's exempt, locked in forever as exempt on property maps. Again, a really shocking thing. Next slide, please. And then we look at the EPBC Act, and I've gone into this. There's no compliance, particularly by the grazing industry. They just don't comply. Forestry has an exemption in Southeast Queensland. And I've documented or calculated over 360,000 hectares of actual matters of national environmental significance, forest habitats bulldozed in just those years, 2018 to 2020, almost all for livestock pasture development. Almost all of it, well, all of it above significant thresholds that I worked on with ACF, and no enforcement. There's never been an enforcement action for failure to refer a pasture development in Queensland, right? Never. So next slide, please. And that's it. Sorry. So that's the end of it.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's really quite clear that the laws are absolutely failing in terms of compliance, and it's shocking to see how much clearing is happening still to this day. So we have a lot of work cut out for us. I know there's a lot of awesome conservationists and activists on this call today. So I'm going to hand over now to QCC's Protected Areas campaigner, Nikki Moffat, who most of you will know, and we'll talk about one of the key ways we can get protection for the greater glider with the Protected Areas Estate and state forests. Over to you, Nikki.
Thanks, Natalie, and I'm like excited but also shocked and depressed at the same time by all those stats, and I've got some more stats for you. So at QCC, we've been working for many years now to expand the Protected Areas Estate. We've managed to champion a record funding increase that has meant lots of land has been acquired in recent years, and new national parks are being created all the time. However, we still only have 8% of our beautiful countryside protected in protected areas, and that's half of what it needs to be. So there is a really good intention to get that up to 17% in Queensland, but the progress towards it is so slow. It'll take you know, between 100 and 1,000 years, depending on which matrix you use to work that out. So with the Great Glider, we and I just want to acknowledge too, lots of activists in Queensland have been working on securing better protections for the Greater Glider and protection for its home, native forests. And I just want to acknowledge in particular Isla Keto and Keith Scott at the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society who've done a huge amount of work and have really helped me and QCC to sort of focus on this space a little more in our forest protection efforts. We've been advocating for an end to native forest logging for some time now, and look, protecting native forests would have a huge benefit for greater gliders. So if I can skip slides, please, Cass. Thanks. One of the reasons that we know vast tracts are really needed for greater glider conservation is that the studies show that they need large patches for viable populations. So 160 square kilometres or 16,000 hectares is what's needed, and replicate that a lot through the landscape if we're going to actually help it rescue it from heading towards extinction. Now we know that forestry has degraded but not removed habitat completely in state-owned forests, and sadly the same trees that are valued for timber are also valued for as habitat for greater gliders. And when we're talking about habitat, we're not just talking about hollows, although they're extremely important, we're talking about feed trees. And it's also important to notice that their ecology is, they use many trees. I think up to 20 trees is what they'll then use in quite a large area. So it's not like they just need the one hollow and they're all sweet. They actually get around quite a lot. They can glide up to 100 metres, and yeah, lots of other fun facts we can get into in the discussion about these amazing critters. But we did notice that, we've heard already that there's more than 20% of the remaining habitat for priority conservation is in state forests. And this study was by Griffith Uni, just put out last year. And it showed that, 21% I think it is, versus is in state forests versus just under 13% actually already protected. So really highlighting the importance there of that particular tenure. And just want to note as well that the largest areas on private land are leasehold land, and this is something, and I think it really emphasises the importance of a landscape scale approach to conservation and protected area growth, and hopefully something that we can discuss in the panel Q&A shortly. Could we skip to the next slide, please, Gus? Thanks so much. So just a quick dive into what we are working on at QCC. We doing a lot of things, advocating, also working with really hard with nature lovers across the state in our regions to raise a profile of this amazing Queensland icon. And, it's possibly the cutest Australian animal that almost no one's heard of. And, no journalist I've spoken to, no decision maker has not wanted to talk more about it once, we raise it with them. We're making sure that people like Jess, Paul and Max, who are out, doing spotlighting in unprotected forests, bio-blitzes that are happening across the state, that they get media coverage, that they actually, that the message gets through to decision makers that people really care about the greater glider, and that we have a responsibility to act now. We're helping coordinate bio-blitzes like this one, and just a shout out to the team that did do this bio-blitz down in Diolmar State Forest, which is near Esk. Max, I think you're on the call, legend for organising that. Hayley, who's sitting next to me, helps volunteers and people across the state to organise things like this. And, you know, Jess and Paul went along to that, did a spotlighting trip at the end of it, and managed to land a story in The Guardian talking about the discovery of a greater glider in that area for the first time in 25 years. So it's pretty exciting for everybody. We're finding that these sorts of events are really fabulous for connecting local nature lovers in an area. And I think that building our movement from the grassroots up is what we really need to be doing, and especially given how close we are to the election. We have a really, in October, the state election in October, we have a really important opportunity now to sort of build that momentum and keep connecting everyone and calling for strong action. Next slide, thanks, Cass. More examples of the awesome coverage that happens when people take action in a local forest. We're helping people everywhere in citizen science, with Hayley at the front there, and also everyone from the Wide Bay Burnett Environment Council, and I think Wildlife Queensland's Maryborough Wide Bay branch sent people out to that BioBlitz where they documented flora and fauna in St Mary's State Forest. Just the absolute highlight of my week this week is not included for its photographic excellence, but that very blurry photo of a greater glider was only taken last week, and it was one of 7 identified in one spotlighting walk through a forest in just near Maryborough, which happens to be Timber HQ, and really just exemplifies why we need to be thinking about what the best use of these public forests really is. And yeah, the pic on the right there is at another BioBlitz, just after another BioBlitz by Banarkin State Forest was taken off the logging schedules after we highlighted how significant its species are. So I'll leave it there for that little insight into what QCC is up to. I'd love to talk more to anyone who wants to. I'm always on the end of the phone or email if you want to get in touch. But I'll hand over to you, Natalie.
Thanks so much, Nikki. It's incredible to see all the work that nature lovers are doing throughout Queensland. And we are hopeful that we will see some good announcements coming up in the next few months as well in terms of more forests being protected. And so like Nikki said, if anyone would like to get involved, please do reach out to any one of the team here to get involved in the forest campaign. So now we're going to open up the floor to all of the panelists, and I would like to make a special welcome, to Kita Ashman as well, that's joining us from WWF for the panel session. And if anybody would like to ask questions, please do drop them in the chat, but we have been compiling those that have come through already as well. So now we've got about half an hour or so to go a little deeper in terms of greater glider conservation and what we can do to protect them. So I'd first like to open up a question for Kita, if you're there. So you've worked in forests in Victoria and New South Wales, studying and championing the greater glider in your role at WWF, and have done a tremendous role about lifting up its presence as well and letting all of Australia know how special the greater glider is. Can you tell us why we often hear about Australia's gliding possums when forest conservation is being discussed, and what does it mean to be a keystone species?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, and great opening question. So I think the reason why we hear a lot about greater gliders and more people are talking about greater gliders, southern and central and northern, all of the different species and subspecies, is because they are, what we would call either like a sentinel species or a flagship species. You've made reference to a keystone species. But if you think about the analogy of like canary in a coal mine, that's effectively what greater gliders are for our forests. So they're an extremely sensitive species. Paul and Martin and Nikki have already, spoken a bit about their habitat requirements. So they require tall, healthy forests with large quantities of, mature hollow-bearing trees all throughout. And so, down here in Victoria and in parts of New South Wales where we've been doing long-term monitoring, greater gliders are one of the first species that we see to start dropping out of sites that are impacted by things like logging. We've had sites in Victoria where the logging has occurred 2 kilometres away, and already we're seeing the flow-on impacts of them starting to drop out and, get fewer and fewer in the long-term monitoring sites. But they are also a sentinel species or an indicator species for climate change, and that interaction between logging and climate change as well, because they have very sensitive thermal requirements. So anything up above kind of 20 degrees or so as an overnight temperature puts these guys in pretty bad place. And a couple of consecutive hot nights like that is enough to have them kind of die from things like heat stress. So I think we're hearing more and more about them because they are that species that really exemplifies the two biggest problems that we're facing for the environment at the moment, which is climate change and deforestation across its various different forms. You're on mute, Natalie.
Oh no, not the classic. I thought we could go an entire webinar without that issue. Sorry, everyone. Thank you so much, Peter, for that. Now just dropping in questions from the chat. We've got one here. Are there any studies done on impacts of overburning or fires on greater glider? And has anyone had any experience concerned with fire around Greenbank military base and impact on gliders? So looking at options. Very specific question, open to the panel. Please jump in, Martin, Keita, or Nikki, or Paul.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. So there has been some specific studies done on fire and greater gliders. So obviously we talked about the big bushfires before, and one single intense fire event can cause a localized extinction because it removes all their food and can remove hollow-bearing trees as well. But there's also negative impacts from prescribed burning from that frequent low-intensity fire. So if you're burning an area, multiple times in the space of a decade, there is papers that have found, greater glider populations dropping by up to 50%, and that's fires that, that aren't really affecting their canopy area where they're living. It's just affecting the understory and probably bringing down a few hollow-bearing trees as well, because they are fairly, old trees, and often they'll den in stags as well, or dead trees. They prefer live trees if they can get them, but stags in particular are really susceptible even to low-intensity fires. So, yeah, there's definitely work around that, and even that low-intensity but repeated burning can reduce populations substantially.
Thanks, Paul. There's an extra question there. How destructive are the continual hazard reduction burns and fire breaks to the gliders as well?
Yeah, so same thing, and I guess this comes into a bit of what Martin mentioned as well. It seems, and I've seen in the chat, I think too, but fire breaks in particular seem to be a really good excuse for people to get out there and remove vast swathes of, vast corridors through otherwise intact habitat, to create a fire break, and that can really fragment habitat. Greater gliders, one thing I didn't mention before is they're very, very reluctant to come to the ground. If you find a greater glider on the ground, it's sick or something's gone horribly wrong. So their dispersal across open areas is minuscule. 50 meters is probably an impenetrable barrier to them. So if you have all these fire breaks throughout a forest, that's basically isolating gliders into little patches with no connection in amongst that forest. So yeah, and as I mentioned, the prescribed burning, that low intensity but frequent fire is definitely known to cause reductions in greater gliders. So I didn't mention before, but Greenbank is an area that Wildlife Queensland has worked in a bit. I don't have much experience with the fire regimes around there. Matt from Wildlife Queensland would know a lot more. He's been watching the greater gliders and yellow-bellied gliders out around Greenbank for probably more than a decade now, so he might have some input into that.
Thanks for that, Paul. There's another question here that says, I think Martin said there was no success of nest boxes in southern Queensland. I'm aiming to get up a nest box project going. Why is it that there is no success in the use of nest boxes in this region?
That's Paul's talk, so I'll leave that to Paul.
Yeah, wonderful question. And I guess the answer at the moment is we don't know. There's been quite good uptake in parts of New South Wales, in Victoria in the wake of the fires, and even in central Queensland. I've heard of some projects up there using multiple nest boxes and having really good and fast success with greater gliders. Yet, Wildlife Queensland's installed a lot of different types of nest boxes within habitat in areas, mainly urban and peri-urban areas in southeast Queensland. And we very occasionally might get, some imagery of a glider having a bit of a look at the hollow, but yeah, the uptake hasn't been anything like what we'd want to see. So that's, yeah, one of the projects we'll be working on later this year is we're going to look at nest boxes and hollows. We're going to put little data loggers inside the hollows, start looking whether there might be temperature and humidity variables that might be keeping greater gliders away from our artificial hollows. Because, you know, they're in these areas where we've got nest boxes and we know they're using the hollows there. So the question is, why aren't they using the artificial hollows? So yeah, really good question that Keita might have a bit more input, because I think she's seen a lot of greater gliders in nest boxes. So
Yeah, I
might
have.
be able to,
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. We designed, we worked with Australian National University and did a whole bunch of, you know, long and rigorous lab testing to design a greater glider specific nest box after the bushfires. And we dropped them into two kind of broad landscapes, one in South Coast New South Wales and another in East Gippsland. And we've had gliders move into them really rapidly. And for the New South Wales sites on the South Coast, in Talaganda, the latest round of data that's just come in, and keep this under your collective hats a little bit, but we've had the populations more than double at the sites that we've deployed nest boxes into. And that's comparing relative to the baseline sites where we, you know, did a BACI design, a before after control impact design, where we deployed nest boxes in some sites, didn't deploy nest boxes in other sites, but monitored all of them pre-deployment and are able to compare to post-deployment figures. And it seems to have had a really significant positive impact on the recovery of the species in those areas that were impacted by the bushfires. So there's probably a lot of different design elements that you could consider, you know, when you're starting to think about putting out nest boxes for gliders. We wrote a paper on the design of the greater glider specific nest box that I'm happy to send through links to if people want to have a look, and I can also share the designs if people are interested in building boxes. But you know, Paul, it'd be great to connect and hear about your kind of work investigating why they're not using the boxes, because I think there's a whole range of reasons, and I think it probably comes down to unbaking the cake a little bit of which specific ingredient might be why they're not getting into there. And we really took an approach that prioritized climate susceptibility and kind of heat, and really buffering them from the impacts of that, because we know how sensitive they can be. And the last thing that we wanted to do was to put out little death trap boxes that they're going to just cook in after bushfires or cook in as the climate kind of heats up. So very happy to send through those resources, and I can share with Nikki and Natalie and others afterwards. And yeah, it'd be good to connect as things go forward, Paul.
Thanks, Keita. A question here from Max. Curious to understand how successful young greater gliders are in dispersing to occupy new territory. Open to anyone who wants to jump in. Keita? Paul?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've done some GPS collaring of greater gliders and looked at home range movements after the bushfires in parts of South Coast New South Wales, and we weren't able to collar any juveniles because they're quite small at that stage, and so for them to be big enough to carry a collar, they kind of have to be at least over the 1 kilo mark and heading, you know, a bit further forward from there in terms of weight range. So to my knowledge, heartbreakingly, this is a species that's gone from really common to vulnerable to endangered in a really short period of time. And so in terms of their social dynamics and social structures and how they're moving and dispersing, and even, you know, how they're denning, whether they're denning independently or with a couple of individuals, or whether they maintain more of a loose kind of colony, we're still kind of figuring out a lot of these social dynamics. It was only a couple of years ago that we even found out there's more than a single species, and there's actually multiple different species. So I think it's probably going to be a case a little bit of informing some of those more detailed questions around their social dynamics and their dispersal rates. But to my knowledge, and from the research that I've been part of, you know, home ranges, like Paul had said, are typically 1 to 3 hectares in your higher quality habitat. So depending on where your juveniles are dispersing to, we often see them hanging around with mum for the first kind of 2 years or so of their life, riding around on her back and then starting to disperse from there. But I wouldn't imagine they'd be dispersing very far, because they typically have pretty high site fidelity from what we've looked at. So probably not too far, but they do have overlapping home ranges as well from what I've seen with my research. So they might hang out for a bit and probably maintain, you know, 1 to 3 to 5 hectare home range nearby would be my guess. But Paul, you probably got things to add.
No, not a lot. I think that covered it really well, Keita. We've seen the same sort of thing, you know, juveniles hanging around with mum till sort of 18 months to 2 years old, and then tending to, you know, it can be a bit hard to tell individuals apart. Most of the populations we monitor are that sort of single colour morph, that dark colour with a lighter belly. So individual recognition is a bit difficult in spotlighting without getting a collar or something on them. And yeah, they don't seem to be going far. But then again, a lot of the populations that I've worked with in depth are sort of pinned into a small area. You know, they're surrounded by urban development, so they don't really have anywhere to go, which is a bit sad. So yeah, their choices are very limited. They have to stay where they are, or face vehicles and houses and dogs and cats and things. So yeah, it would be nice to learn a little bit more about their dispersal, I think.
Thanks, Paul. Now, I think, yeah, there's quite a few questions coming in terms of what we can do to help the greater glider. But first, I just want to tackle one of these tricky ones in terms of logging. In Queensland, we undertake selective logging. So a question here about why can't logging and greater gliders coexist if selective logging is done well? So probably one of these for either Paul or Nikki, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. I'll have a go at that one. Look, sadly, as I mentioned, just really briefly, the same species are valued for timber that are preferred by greater gliders. So that's one problem. The other issue is that selective logging actually takes up to 50% of the basal area, so half of the wood in the forest goes. And because we have such poor reporting in Queensland, we don't actually know how frequently our forests have been logged and plan to be logged. There's no sustainable yield that's been applied, so there's no like annual rate of cut that is established with a scientific basis about how much is okay to take. And we know that forestry makes those calculations based on timber supply obligations and, you know, supply agreements, not based on the ecology of the species in the forest. So I think it's not the way forward is definitely not to keep managing them by logging them. When you walk into these forests, even though we don't know exactly how often they've been logged, they have been simplified dramatically. You can see that the structure is really different. The floristics are really, really different to, you know, a multi-structured, you know, forest that would have lots of different age trees. And if we're taking out trees that are the hollows of the future, as well as, you know, the existing ones where there are still hollows, there's just not going to be any habitat for the greater glider moving forward. Anyone else have any comments on that one?
Yeah, if I could just add, I think in my opinion, it's often to do with trying to balance having a genuinely profitable timber industry with having genuinely good outcomes for species. And even if you're doing one, you can't really have the other. So if you're actually managing a timber industry so that you are going to have good outcomes for greater gliders and so they can coexist, that's not creating a model that actually creates a profitable financial model for the timber industry. You have to be operating on such a low scale of harvesting that it's just not financially viable. Or, you know, if you're operating a profitable timber industry, then you've got poor outcomes for greater gliders. The two, you know, really what it comes down to is kind of what Nikki was saying. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. You know, down here in Victoria and in lots of places in New South Wales, we're operating on timber harvesting rotations of 20 to 30 years. So even if you come through and selectively log, come back in 20 years' time and selectively log in another 20 years' time and selectively log. And we know that it takes much, much longer than 20 years to grow trees back. And we know that a lot of forests, once they've been logged, close to a third of what's been logged isn't coming back, isn't regenerating because of things like climate change and the drying and warming environment as well. So yeah, ultimately gliders need trees, logging industry needs trees, and trying to balance that, especially when you're trying to balance it to create an economically viable industry, is just where it all falls down.
Thanks for that, Keita. Yeah, there's some huge conflicts underway, absolutely. And I want to just throw over to Martin now to explore, like, what needs to happen? You know, we speak about these loopholes. There are many loopholes that allow for the broad scale clearing of habitat of threatened species. So probably just over to Martin first, and then the rest of the panel in terms of what do we need to do to ensure that we do get better outcomes for species like the greater glider in terms of planning and policy.
Well, I think just repeat the points, Natalie, which is that, you know, what QCC is campaigning for, what all those regional groups are campaigning for is get those state forests protected, keep logging out, end logging of state forests, move them across to the park system. Something that Isla, Keto and Keith Scott have been campaigning for decades now, and they initiated originally the state forest process, commitments by earlier Labor governments to have a long-term plan to transfer state forests across. It's taking too long, it's too slow. You know, species are becoming endangered that shouldn't become endangered because it's too slow. I think that's probably number one issue. The second issue is trying to get reform to the acts that govern, that regulate the destruction of native habitat, principally the Vegetation Management Act, where we have these huge areas that are just totally exempt, even though the forest has been regrowing there for 30 years. You know, we've got big trees come back, but it's just all mapped exempt, you know, and I'm afraid to say that it's Labor government that gave all that away back in the Beattie days, or, you know, where those exemptions were locked in permanently. So you know, the graziers have got these areas of forest habitat that may have wildlife in them, but it's just totally exempt under the Vegetation Management Act. They can just bulldoze it anytime they like, and they do, because that's what dominates most of the clearing of forest in Queensland, is the grazing industry clearing places that have been mapped exempt on their property maps. So reform of that is obviously important. Removing the loopholes from the Nature Conservation Act, so that it doesn't matter whether your taking is directed at the animal or not. You know, if you're destroying its habitat, you should be liable and prosecutable under the Act. Likewise, under the EPBC Act, I think there's, I don't think, you know, I'm in two minds of whether we really need to reform the Act, because the big problem is simply that it's just not being complied with. And secondly, that it's not being enforced, and it's being not being enforced in a very biased way in favour of graziers. So graziers have been basically let off the hook for the last 30 years, 20 years that the Act is, over 20 years now, that the Act has been enforced. So the regulator has just turned a blind eye. And so now, as far as graziers are concerned, they've got a carte blanche. They don't, you know, they've got a de facto exemption from the EPBC Act, because the regulators allowed them to get away with it for so long. They go after the mining industry and so forth, and so they should. But, you know, the grazing industry has been just totally unenforced.
Thanks for that, Martin. We do have another question here as well that is relevant to this. It says, when it comes to renewables being put in areas that impact greater glider habitat, what is QCC's position? So I just wanted to answer this one directly. You know, obviously we are in a transition right now to renewable energy, and that is absolutely needed, as all of the threatened species we love, like the greater glider, are continuing to feel impacts from the impacts of climate change, and that's changing their behaviours, it's changing how they reproduce and their long-term outcomes as well. So we want to ensure that the transition to renewable energy is a win for nature and a win for climate. So it's really a planning issue here. We've spoke about these loopholes thanks to Martin, in terms of the EPBC Act needs to be enforced. It needs, and it's going through a once in a generation reform right now as well, which will be critical to the transition. But also at a state level as well, our planning laws need to ensure that any development, whether it be renewables, housing, mining, whatever, does actually protect our threatened species, including the greater glider. So we are, you know, we've got very active campaigns to ensure that those planning laws are reformed and do deliver on those outcomes for greater gliders. I just wanted to, yeah, we're kind of coming close to time now as well. And I just wanted to open the floor to the panel in terms of other things of what we can do as a collective, as a community, to protect the greater glider. So over to someone else on the panel, if you would like to jump in. Everyone's
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the best way is just to put pressure on your local politicians and politicians of all levels to, you know, if politicians don't see, unfortunately, this is just the cynic in me, but if they don't see the value in, you know, putting money into the environment, if it's not going to cost them votes, then it's always going to be lower down on the priority list than something else. So if you can talk to your local member, you know, state member, federal member, whatever it might be, and just say, you know, you're concerned with logging in state forests and logging in general, and the removal of those large trees, and that threatened species are a priority for you, then, you know, the more calls and emails and letters they get about that sort of thing, the more it's going to be on their radar. And, you know, then they'll start to worry about, hey, maybe not doing something about this could lead to, you know, me getting turfed at the next election, basically. So, yeah, I think it really needs to come down to that. You know, we can all make that positive change by talking to our local members and raising the environment up, you know, to be one of those top 3 issues in the country. It should be. We're destroying the environment that we rely upon to live ourselves, not just our threatened species, but us as a species. So we really need to have that as, you know, as high up on the priority list as we can.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. Did you want to jump in there, Keita?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Paul's done a really good job of highlighting the things that you can do both at like the personal level that operate at that community level. You obviously need to have like a number of people showing up saying, I care about these things, so that politicians get nervous if they don't act on those things. I think there's a range of things that you can do at the individual level, just that like can be helpful, not just for greater gliders, but for all threatened species and climate crisis wise, that, you know, doesn't require chasing down politicians and stuff too, although you should be doing that also. But things like kind of checking who you're banking with, checking who your super is with, those types of things, is obviously, you know, a range of really good, ethical, sustainable organizations. But a lot of people don't realize that where they keep their money is funding a lot of deforestation and a lot of problems at a pretty significant level. So checking in on those things at the individual level can be something you can do in your spare time that can have a really positive impact. And then obviously things like, you know, Martin's done a great job in highlighting why our forests are being cut down. And one of the leading things for deforestation in Australia is beef and the cattle industry. So, you know, eating plant-based as much as possible, and as much as, you know, you enjoy doing that, is always a great thing too. So I think there's things that you can do at that collective level that requires you to add your voice and needs lots of people to pile on to get politicians to care. But there's definitely stuff you can do at home in your own time that definitely has a massive impact also.
Thanks so much, Keita. And just on a closing note, if each of the panelists want to share their favourite greater glider moment, just a quick like 20-second story or something on your favourite greater glider moment. Paul?
Up first, I think actually I'll draw on one of Nikki's slides from before, but I think, yeah, one of my highlights is always showing people their first greater glider. So I think going out to the Diongwall BioBlitz a few weeks back and showing the team, you know, those who stayed on in the cold and the sort of drizzly, misty rain in the evening, to go out in the forest and see a greater glider. And then a couple of those people have been back out, you know, multiple times per week and keep emailing me, telling me, oh, we're seeing the same greater glider, or we're seeing a different one close by. And just to, you know, to hear that enthusiasm from people about a species that they probably didn't know about, you know, before we went out there, it's absolutely amazing. And I think with that groundswell of support, people getting to those sort of events, they're amazing. You meet so many like-minded people. They refresh and recharge my batteries every time I attend. So yeah, highly recommend that. But I think that's my most recent favorite moment that I can think of off the top of my head.
I still haven't seen one, so I'm in the flesh. I've been out a few times, including with you, Paul. I've helped organise things where others have seen them. But I have seen other gliders, and actually one of my formative experiences as a young activist was living in a forest down in Victoria where there were very noisy gliders like sugar gliders or yellow belly gliders and squirrel gliders. And I just remember, lying on my back and watching these crazy critters just flying from tree to tree, being so boisterous and noisy. And of course, the greater glider is the absolute opposite to that. So I can't wait to see it. But I think one fun fact that really endears the greater glider to me is how the baby lives in the pouch for a few months and then will come and sit on mum's back and fly around, glide around with her for at least 3 months, 3-4 months while it's growing.
I'll jump in with my favourite glider memory. It was after the bushfires in 2019, 2020. It was a bit of a weird time. So COVID was still making it hard to get out into the field, but we'd put together all the nest boxes and we'd already deployed them. And then we had a bit of a weird lockdown happen. And then 10 weeks later, we went back out and I'm a tree climber and I help with deployment of the nest boxes and the cameras. And so we were going out to put up remote sensing cameras to monitor the usage of the nest boxes and hopefully catch gliders moving in. But I thought, that could take, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, whatever. But I was halfway up, climbing up this 25-30 meter big tree, and I saw this greater glider head pop out of the nest box just 10 weeks after we deployed the nest boxes. So I'll drop a link into the YouTube. I kind of working with WWF, I'm like, oh my God, crying, but also tried to film some of it. So there's actually footage once I get up to the top of the tree and kind of was just snuck my phone into the nest box to have a look at who was in there. And there was not 1 but 3 gliders in there, which is amazing to see after 10 weeks. So that's probably a favourite of mine.
Well, I can't be sure I've seen a glider. I mean, I was up in Yabba State Forest about 3 years ago, spotlighting, and saw something that might have been, but it wasn't gliding. It was crawling up the tree, and I was looking again, damage after the big fires, particularly all that area around Peachtree Campground got really burnt out right down into the gully, and I couldn't be sure it was just a brushtail.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And whether it was a brushtail or a greater glider, I think we can all agree that any experience with nature is really special. So thank you so much to everybody who's joined us today online and to our phenomenal panelists for giving up their time to share their love and their passion for greater gliders. So one of the key things really a lot of people have been asking is what can we do? What should we do? We know that there's many policies and planning laws that are broken, that are not supporting the long-term health and viability of the greater gliders. And part of our key work here at QCC is obviously to campaign and advocate on behalf of these very special and cute animals. So we do have an action at the moment. We'd love you all to jump on. I think Hayley's dropping the link in the chat at the moment to email the Queensland Environment Minister, Leonard, and to put pressure on her to ensure that we get those planning reforms and law reforms that we need. We obviously just yesterday had the Queensland state budget, and unfortunately it was woefully inadequate for the protection of threatened species here in Queensland. So we'll be pushing a lot harder for stronger investment as well. And as Nikki mentioned before, we are coming up for a Queensland state election later on in this year. So we've been working hard with our regional environmental groups and also the Wilderness Society to launch a brand new campaign, Stand Up for Nature. And it's building off the success of the very bright, yellow and fun Climate Action Now signs, which I'm sure many of you have seen around. So these Stand Up for Nature signs will be distributed right across the country in the lead up to the state election. And so we encourage everybody to get involved. We'll be handing them out at stalls and events and things as well. And the aim here is really to elevate nature, make it one of those top 3 priorities. That is the ultimate goal here. So we really encourage everybody to get involved, either grab a sign or jump online as well, distribute it with your members. They are free signs, and we're wanting to ensure that nature really is a priority this year. It's incredibly urgent. Each year more and more species are being being added to the threatened species list. And as we've seen with the greater glider, you know, it was vulnerable then endangered very quickly, and we don't truly understand what is required for the long-term viability of these species. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us here today. We will send an email around with these slides and a few updates as well in terms of some of these questions that people want answered. And that's everything. Any final words, Nikki?
I just want to thank you, Natalie and Hayley and Cass and everyone else who's jumped in. This was, you know, a little idea that I had a little while ago, and I feel like getting everyone together like this and sharing knowledge and passion for this species is so important. I want to do it again. If you want to stay in touch, please just get in touch on any of the channels and come back for the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.